interrupting the show for a special report.
Because now it is time for Bag Lab.
Okay, so for tonight's demonstration for Bag Lab, I wanted to talk about how to convert a bag so that you can use it as a waist bag instead of a traditional bag, off the shoulder bag. So for the demonstration tonight, I'm going to show you how to sew a simple sleeve on the back of the bag before you start assembling it, and then use either a fabric strap or some webbing as the waist portion and attach a parachute buckle and a little bit of hardware. So Danny's going to switch to the overhead camera. I'm starting off with the back of my bag. So whatever bag you're working on, you'll just need the piece that will be the back of the bag, and you'll need to also take into consideration if the pattern that you're using calls for anything else added to the back of the bag. So you'll need to keep that in mind because we're going to be adding a sleeve near the top edge so that we can thread either the webbing or the strapping into the sleeve. So before we get to that, if you would like to use webbing, you'll just need at least 40 inches, perhaps longer, depending on the wear of the finished bag. And if you're not going to use webbing, you can use a bit of fabric instead. So I've already prepared, well, partially prepared my strap made of fabric. I cut my fabric 40 inches long by 4 inches wide because I'm going to be using 1 inch wide hardware, and we need to multiply that times 4 to get the width for pressing. Again, if you need a different length, depending on the wear, you'll just cut yours longer, but I would at least cut it 40 inches long. And I've already attached some Shapeflex interfacing, and I centered the interfacing and I cut it 3/4 of an inch shorter than the length of my actual fabric. So I went ahead and sort of pre-press this to save time, and I'm just going to give it a final pressing. So I pressed both of the short ends in toward the wrong side by 1/2 inch, and then I pressed the long edges toward the center, and then I pressed again. So I'm going to go ahead and add some Wonder Clips on this to hold the fabric in place. And on my sewing machine, I went ahead and changed the stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching, and we're going to be top stitching both of the long edges using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let me get the Wonder Clips finished on here, and we'll get this over to the sewing machine. And for top stitching straps, lately I've been top stitching both of the long edges in the same direction. In the past, I've kind of sewn down one long edge and then kind of flipped it and come down the opposite long edge, and I feel like I'm able to get a little bit neater of a stitching and a distribution of the fabric if I just stitch in the same direction both times. All right, so let me get this over to the sewing machine. I'm just going to do a small bit of stitching because I am going to finish up with that nylon strapping, but I just wanted to discuss this since I wanted to give a fabric option as well. And obviously you'll want to sew both the entire long edges, but I just wanted to demonstrate the sewing from the same direction, going down both long ends of the strap. Okay, so for the sleeve that's going to be attached to the back of the bag, you'll need to decide based on what piece you're attaching it to how long you want it to be. You want it to stay well clear of the side edges, but if your piece is longer or shorter than mine, you can obviously adjust the length of your piece. So I cut my piece 7 inches long to fit nicely on this particular piece, and I went ahead and cut it 3.5 inches in width. So for 1 inch parachute clip and 1 inch hardware, you'll cut your piece 3.5 inches wide as well. Okay, so I'm going to take this fabric and I'm going to just finger press it right sides together so that both of the long edges meet. And I'm just going to add some wonder clips. So I'm going to sew this using my regular stitch length. On my machine, that's 2.5 millimeters. I'm going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew the short end. I'm going to pivot at the corner, and then I'm going to sew at least 1 inch in. Same thing on the other side, because we need to leave an opening centered so that we can turn everything right side out. Okay, now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut on a diagonal across the corner without cutting into the stitching. What that does is it, excuse me, grab some water. What that does is it reduces bulk in the corners when you turn everything right side out. And I'm going to use my precision turning tool to gently push out the corners. I'm going to use my iron to give this a press, and I'm also going to press the opening toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so now I'm going to attach this sleeve to what will be the back of the bag. And you want to stay clear of the top edge, and I'm also going to measure it so that it's centered. So I'll measure, let's see. I'll place this 1 inch down from the top edge. I've got my opening at the top as well. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm only going to sew the top edge. Make sure to backstitch well at start and stop. I'm going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3 millimeters for stitching this particular piece down. And one other tip, which I'm just thinking of now, if you'd like to, you can fuse a small piece of either Decoville Heavy or Pellon Peltex to the wrong side on top of the interfacing. In my case, this is foam interfacing. It doesn't need to cover the whole piece. You can perhaps just have a smaller rectangle. You'll want it to be bigger than the actual sleeve piece. And what that does is if you've got that fused to the other side and then you go to stitch this down, the stitches will go through that additional interfacing and provide some extra stability for the sleeve, because the webbing or the strap will be going through this piece. And completely optional, but I don't think it's a bad idea to have the extra interfacing. Again, just a small little rectangle just to reinforce the stitching on this sleeve piece. Okay, so I'm going to use the 1 inch webbing for this demonstration. If you've gotten that strap prepared with fabric instead, you'll just use your strap piece instead with the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and slide it in so that it hits the stitching line at the top. And I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch down the lower edge 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. And the idea is not to sew through the webbing at all, so I'm just moving it out of the way. If you've got a strap piece that you've sewn that's quite thick, perhaps you used a different material like vinyl or leather, you might need to adjust the width of this piece so that you can have it stay clear of the bottom stitching line. But as you can see, for the webbing, it works quite nicely. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and just sew this lower edge 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. Okay, so I've got my piece here. As you can see, the webbing is free to go through the sleeve a bit. And now I'm going to start by attaching the parachute clip. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just thread it through this end, which is the end with the prongs. And I'm going to pull a couple of inches of the webbing out the other side. So I'm going to fold the webbing over, and we're going to stitch the webbing to itself. Let me cut it so we get a nice clean edge. I'm going to fold it back by about 1/2 inch, and we're going to stitch it to itself 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the webbing, and also 1/4 inch away from the edge of the webbing. And it should look like, let me pull it through. We want it, if your parachute buckle is curved like mine is, you'll want it to look like this when it's face down, so that when the wearer is wearing it, the curved edge will be against the wearer's body. Okay, so now we're going to add, let me pull this to the side. Now we're going to add the metal slider. So I'm going to take the webbing and thread it through the first side and then bring it up the second side. And then I'm going to finish this piece off by bringing it through the other side of the parachute buckle. And then I'm going to create a little bit of a space so that I can see that middle bar in the slider. I'm going to bring the end of the webbing down, and then I'm going to bring it up the other end of the slider. And we're going to be stitching this webbing to itself, so just look at the piece that came through the slider. That's what we're going to be stitching down. Okay, so again, I'm going to fold this end back by about 1/2 inch, and then we're just going to stitch this end to itself. So 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, and then also 1/4 inch away from the edge. Okay, so that's what it looks like when it's finished. Here's the adjustable portion, and I think this is a great way, especially if you have a favorite, perhaps Sew Sweetness pouch, maybe one of the larger pouches. I think this is a great way if you'd like to convert it into a waist bag. I think it's a great way to make a lot of use out of some of your favorite pouch patterns. And this is fun and easy, and just something to change up an already existing pattern into a waist bag. So I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. As you can see, it was fast and easy to put together, and yeah, I'm all for making lots of use out of patterns. I see in the Facebook group on a daily basis people taking a pattern that was originally for a certain purpose and completely changing it up and modifying it to fit their needs. And so I always love to see that. And so I hope that will be useful to you in the future when you're doing some of modifications of your own.